Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture Crop Talk webinar. If you have any questions during this presentation, please type them into the question section of the GoToWebinar menu, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Laurie. I'd like to welcome everybody to Crop Talk for October the 23rd. Usually by this time of year, we're done crop talks, and we've had harvest in the bin for probably 2 or 3 weeks, but it seems like this year that's dragging out, and we're going to be doing this or having harvest for a little bit longer. So today what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about, do a bit of a crop update, and then I was going to go through the year and a kind of a review as to what happened throughout the year, a little update on that, and again, this will be the last webinar for this year. So a little bit of a crop update to start with, and I guess this happened a couple weeks ago when we first got the first snowfall or the major storm that went through. It was interesting the amounts of snow that fell, and actually different areas did receive quite significant amounts. This was a picture from the Holland area, and this was about 2 or 3 days after the actual event. So you could still see they had 52 centimeters of snow, which would be close to 2 feet. So this was in the Holland area. So probably one of the areas that was in kind of the middle of the storm and received, probably some of the major amounts. I think Carberry was another one that was in that same area that received close to or a little over 70. So definitely a lot of snowfall in that area. And if you go for a drive, you definitely can see areas that receive more snowfall, as there's still a fair bit of snow in a lot of those fields and along road edges and in ditches. Further you come west, there was a lot less snow, maybe a little bit more rain off the start, but in some of those areas, farmers were able to get back out into the field and to get harvesting a little bit quicker. When you look at where we sit right now for the weather or the weather map for the last, I guess, since for the season here, and you look and you see where we landed up for the year. We look at our overall rainfall, and you see the amounts look to be pretty close to that 100% or better for most areas. Quite the difference from the spring, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later. But when you look at this, pretty much every area is 100% or better, and then we do have some extreme areas where they're 140 to 150% of normal. And prime example is that Wawanesa area and the Boissevain area that are extremely wet right now. Look at about our growing degree days for the season, and we didn't quite make the 100% of normal in most cases, and that's reflective of a lot of the later season crops. You see a lot of the corn, sunflowers, soybeans are still unharvested, and just because of the dragging out of the season has made those crops basically not quite ready to combine when the combining was good, and now where combining is going to be a little bit more difficult. They're starting to ripen in some cases even the frost has taken care of most of those crops. Really cool here, and in most areas in the southwest this morning we were looking at -7 and wind chills of almost -14, I think they were saying on the radio. So cool night last night, and they're predicting that for the next couple of nights. So if anything, it might harden the ground up and make it a little bit easier for traveling. This is, I guess, the U.S. map showing the 6 to 10 day outlook for temperature, and kind of goes to what we've been seeing starting last night. You can see we're looking at anywhere from 90 to 90% of probability of below normal temperatures, and so this is your Manitoba, Saskatchewan right up there, and we're in the dark blue. So probably going to be seeing cool temperatures for the next little while here. They are forecasting some day temperatures to be in the double digits, but I could see us cooling off in the evenings and getting fairly cold. So again, that'll have an impact on harvest, because when you get the white frost, it takes a fair bit of time for things to dry down in the morning to early afternoon before we can get out there and start harvesting again. When you look at where we're sitting, I guess, as harvest progress for the province, so this chart is for all of Manitoba. So you see we're basically sitting at about 74%, 74-75% complete, which is below the 3-year average, which we normally be about 88% complete at this time. Major crops that are still out there, again, is some of our cash crops, our canola, flax, soybeans, and then grain corn and sunflowers, which basically have barely begun to be harvested yet. When you look at the reporting areas for when we do the crop reports and try to determine the percentages of crop remaining, you can see where some of these areas are fairly large. And when you look at the southwest area where I work out of here, the area takes in quite a few RMs. And so you can see we're reporting in some cases can be difficult to get a close average, because you have pockets in the areas where they've received more snow/rain. And like I mentioned at the beginning, the Wawanesa area right through to probably Don number 2 highway has been fairly wet. The Boisvane area has been fairly wet. You go north of 45 highway, there's several areas in there that have been fairly wet. And even north of 16 highway down through Minnedosa, if you look at the southwest. So again, every area's got pockets that are a little bit behind or maybe farther ahead. So when you look when it's broken down into the different regions, and if you want to talk about the southwest here, which is probably the region that's the farthest behind in harvest in the province, you look at canola, we're about 55% complete, so still a fair bit of canola out there. I think over the last couple of days, producers have been back out there going again. The crops are definitely not dry. I think what's happening now is wherever producers are able to travel, and where if they have access to grain drying, they are going out there and trying to get some done. You definitely know that they're not in full swing, because in a lot of fields you'll see one or maybe 2 combines going, and basically just enough so they can keep the dryer going. You look at flax, we're about 20% done, which again is fairly low for this time of year. Soybeans 10% done. We just nicely got started probably last week with soybeans, and talking to producers, they're anywhere from 18 to 20% moisture. So definitely needing some type of drying system, whether it's an air bin or a dryer. Get talking to some of the edible bean growers down, especially in that Boisvane country. They're looking at crop right now that is fairly wet, and dry beans are definitely are a little bit harder to combine when the ground is wet, because they're really low to the ground. And I think a lot of these producers are starting to be concerned of whether they'll be able to get that crop off at all this year. And then you get into the sunflowers and the grain corn. Again, just the odd person started. Corn silage, basically wherever they can travel. I think a lot of the custom silagers have been moving around a fair bit, trying to get the fields wherever they can travel on. And I think that's the biggest holdup with doing corn silage right now. So this is what the pods and soybeans look like about week to 10 days ago, right after the snowfall. So it looked like there was a fair bit of snow in them, and there was some concern about how well the pods were going to hold up. And then this is kind of what happened after the snow started to melt. This is more to the eastern side of the province, and you can see a lot of the ditches were full of water, and we had overland flooding in some of those areas. And even field access was difficult. So you can see where it was going to be hard to harvest. But when you looking a little bit closer, you see that in some areas the bean harvest has been going on, and the pods seem to hold on fairly good. I think the biggest concern right now is just being able to travel in some of those fields, and that's the risk part right now. Canola, well, when the wind was blowing, when we got the snow, it seemed, if anything, was swathed. A lot of the canola swaths on the southern side, because most of the winds were from the north. On the southern sides of the swaths, there was a bank made, and this is where we're running into problems with swath canola right now. A lot of that snow is melting, but it's taking a little bit longer to melt. And then with these cool evenings, it's whatever does melt freezes. I was talking to some producers the last couple days, and what they're seeing is when they go out to harvest or trying to harvest the swath canola right now, they're seeing that they're getting ice crystals in the sample, which later as the grain is being put in a bin or being looked at for storage, those crystals start to melt, and when that happens, your grain is going to get wetter. So I think a lot of producers right now are holding on and hoping we can get some of those double-digit days that they've been talking about in the forecast, to maybe take care of those wet areas, and it doesn't even need to be wet areas. Basically, you got the snowbank that needs to be gone, and the water needs to dry up, so we can get at those swaths. I mentioned that canola was about 55% complete, and it's a combination of strike cut and swath. In the strike cut, I've seen more guys attempting strike cut the last couple of days than some of the guys with swaths. And I mentioned about the swath having issues with a little bit harder to combine. Strike cut stuff definitely has lodged a lot. In a lot of cases, it's pretty much flat on the ground, and producers are having to travel really slow to pick that up, and I think they're having some issues there. So both types, whether it's swath or strike cut, are having issues for producers, and I think definitely slowing down the harvest. I mentioned about the cereal harvest, and it's about 90 to 95% complete. I think this picture kind of shows what most of the cereals look like in the Southwest here right now, pretty much flat to the ground. And in a lot of cases, I think producers are really looking at the value of some of this crop, and whether it's going to be worth going after. I've talked about it in the past couple of webinars regarding the picture below, where I took to some of the swath wheat, and where it's sprouting. I have seen some producers starting to bale up some of those swaths and trying to salvage some feed value out of it. Regarding the standing cereals, it's amazing that how they've been holding on. If you go out into those fields and shell out those heads, there's sprouting for sure, but excuse me, not as bad as some of the sprouting in some of the swath crop. Those swaths just got so saturated, and underneath they were so wet that it's just hard for them to dry out. And I guess the biggest issue we're having is field conditions are just so wet right now that whether you're traveling or trying to do anything, it's just making things a lot more difficult, and adding extra hours to every process, whether you're having to haul grain to the roads to unload, to whether you're having to just watch where you're going with the harvesting equipment. So that's about all I have to talk about today regarding the crop update. And as you can see, we're probably still, I would say we need, in a lot of cases, a couple of weeks before we'll be done harvest. So hopefully we'll be getting some good weather between now and then. Looking at last year and kind of starting from the spring of last year, and I'm hoping we're not going to be faced with the same situation this spring, but last spring we did have a crop that had to stay out over winter, and You know, it was surprising this spring, the quality of some of that crop that did overwinter. And in some cases, even the protein was even better than expected on some of those fields. So it can be done. It was done this spring, so crop can sit out over winter and be harvested in the spring. Hopefully not, but I guess worst case scenario there, that is an option. I think of all the crops, I think canola was probably the one that maybe suffered the most because it just seemed to not be able to, I guess, hold the seed in the pot, and it just was shelling out more. And I think producers did experience lower yields for sure in the spring when they went out and did some of the canola. There was a combination this spring of straight cut and swath canola, and I don't think there was a big difference between the two talking to producers. So again, hopefully we're not faced with this situation and for next spring, but if it has to happen, I guess it can be done. So looking at our spring season and what we went through, and you know, seed had started probably in the middle of April this year, which is probably in a lot of cases a little bit on the early side for most of southwestern Manitoba, depending on where you are. The southern part of the region is usually gets out there a lot faster, and you know, middle of April for them is not out of the question. I think our biggest issue was, you know, the cool, damp soils this spring, the slowed down germination, and then we started getting some weather events like this one on May the 1st, where we got some snow that slowed producers down, and it really spread out seeding. You look at the May 8th seeding report, and you look at that time, we were approximately 70% of the wheat was in. You know, and basically all the peas were in. We had the majority of the cereals planted by that date. And at that time, there was a lot of producers planting canola, but we were also had producers waiting for the soil to warm up so they could get planting. And so, you know, at that time, we were already starting to experience some cool and soil conditions, which were affecting germination. And this was a couple of slides we showed back then where we were seeing wheat germinating, and you could see where definitely not the way we normally would be seeing a row of wheat come up. It was the cold spring, the soils were cool. We were also experiencing some really dry conditions at that time. So we had dry, cool soil. And I think the other thing we noticed, or a lot of producers noticed, that they were seeing a lot more of this in the zero till where there was more trash and the soil stayed colder for a longer period of time. When you looked at our soil temperature maps during that time period, so anywhere up to the, you know, basically the end of April, we were still seeing temperatures of 6 degrees Celsius for soil temperature, and then that's at 5 centimeters, so that'd be at your seeding depth. So when you're seeing that, you know, there's several crops that will not be germinating the way they should be. You know, when you look at, you know, crops like canola, even wheat, you know, if you can keep it around that 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, you know, you're going to have those crops seeded and those seeds germinating, coming through the ground quick. And I think we experience a lot of fluctuations, and I think that for several producers, it showed later on as the crops started coming up. And I think in some cases with some of the cereal crops, we noticed that, and even it carried through to the end of the year. And some of those fields that were sown, you know, the last part of April, first week of May, they just didn't germinate as well, and they had more issues throughout the growing season. You know, examples, you know, more weed issues, and those crops didn't yield quite as good as some of the ones sown a little bit later. I mentioned that the dry conditions we were having this spring as well, and you look basically through most of Manitoba, we were in the red. So we were less than 40% of normal precipitation. So again, showing us that we had a couple issues this spring in getting the crop up and going. When you look at May the 22nd, we had cereals about 90% done, canola about 70% done. Producers were putting soybeans in already, and overall seeding for the area was about 70 to 75% done. And in a lot of areas, producers had already finished planting the crop. And where did that put us compared to our 5-year average? Well, we're pretty much right on par for our 5-year average. So, everything seemed to be moving pretty much right along. And I think our biggest factor when we got to the end of May was in a lot of producers' minds, is we were either on the borderline of being dry to just barely having enough moisture to get that crop growing. And I think as we go through a few more slides here, we'll see where that even showed up a little bit more. So, but we still were getting cool temperatures. So on May the 27th, we actually had a frost go through the whole area, and a combination of cold weather and dryness seemed to be more of a factor than anything. And we did see quite a few fields that were showing symptoms of frost. And there's just a picture of a canola plant that was showing frost. They all came back. We didn't really have any issues for reseeding because of frost, but we did see some setbacks of some of the crop. And then even with the cereal crops, we did get some banding, and you can see the banding that occurred when it was closer to the soil surface. And that's caused by either two things, either heat or cold conditions. And in this case, it was the cool conditions. When you look at the forecast or the map weather report for that time period, pretty much the whole Southwest was minus during that time period. So some areas definitely showed more frost. Boys Wayne area -3, Lake Audie up by the park -4. So definitely areas that got cool enough that some damage was shown. But again, very little reseeding needs to happen because of the cool conditions. I think our biggest issue with reseeding and for a lot of producers was our insect problems. We had probably one of the biggest issues of cutworms that I've seen in a few years. They were basically excuse me, doing damage in most of the crops. I knew producers that were reseeding some of their cereal crops. I don't think anybody actually had to reseed a whole field, but I know there was producers that were doing spots in the field and reseeding because of cutworms. Some producers were reseeding canola fields because of cutworms, because of the damage being done. And the damage was compounded because of the cool, dry conditions and the plants growing so slow that the cutworms just seemed to look like they were doing more damage because our normal plant stand wasn't there. And then if it wasn't the cutworms, it was the flea beetles. And we had, again, a long period of time needed for the plants to get established, and they just couldn't keep ahead of the flea beetles. So we definitely had a lot of producers this year spraying for flea beetles and cutworms, and in some cases spraying more than once. So again, something that we need to remember for next year is that we should probably be looking at timing some of our seeding to soil conditions, and monitoring more of our soil conditions to making sure some of these crops can be planted and out of the ground in a quicker time period, so we can take advantage of the insecticide treatments that are on some of the oil seeds, and even in the cereal crops, just to get them out of the ground quicker so that they can become established better and just develop better. When we're talking about some insects, might as well talk a little bit about Bertha armyworm and diamondback. Really not a big issue this year. The traps never showed levels where we had a lot of problems with them. But again, it's there were some spots that producers did have to do some control with. Diamondback moth, again, the same thing. I didn't hear of anybody having to spray for diamondback moth, but the numbers again in the traps were low. Regarding insects in the cereal crops, again, nothing that major that needed to be done. I don't think any producers were doing any spraying for insects in cereal crops. We'll look at some of the fall crops, and when you look at winter wheat and fall rye, they got off to a good start. They took advantage of the early moisture we had and were able to develop. Again, the cool temperatures slowed the growth, so we were concerned about them for a while, but then as things started to warm up, they just seemed to jump and get ahead. So it actually turned out to be a fairly good year for winter wheat and fall rye. They were able to take advantage of that moisture. I've talked to several producers of winter wheat that not several, I guess, the producers that I knew they were growing winter wheat, and protein levels were really good for them this year, and yields were anywhere from average to slightly above average. So I think a good year for winter wheat and fall rye. The crops did do fairly well. Peas, I think one of the good stories of the year as well. They got off early. They seem to be able to handle the cool soil, and again, producers were planting them fairly early, so they took advantage of the spring moisture. There was no major disease issues again in the peas this year. Mycosporella started to show up a little bit later, but it never seemed to do any major damage and didn't affect any yield. And when it came into harvest, the weather was good. Producers were able to get out there, get them off before any of the weather started to change and get wet, and so we had anywhere from average to above average yields and good quality. Regrowth started to become an issue for some producers, but they were able to manage that with some chemical to control the regrowth. There are still the odd field of peas out there. I'm not quite sure what happened there, but there are still some issues there. Canola, well, I talked a bit about canola already, and as to getting off to the slow start and a lot of the issues it had with insect problems. One of the positive things in the year was for the crop looks to be average throughout the growing season. No major diseases showed up that really affected yield. Sclerotinia levels were low. Blackleg levels were fairly low, probably more due to the dry conditions that we had earlier on. And as we got closer to harvest and guys started combining, seed quality looked really good. We did have some frosts later on in the year, and probably later in August, where there was some frost happening in north of 45 Highway, and I just threw a picture in there as what some of the frost we were seeing, just some spotting on the pods. When you look at, I guess when we get into September, so we're getting into the cereal timing for harvest, and we were starting to experience some of the rainfall events that were starting to happen, and things were getting a little bit wetter. So producers were trying to get some of the crop off as quick as they could before losing some quality in some of the cereal crops. So right around the beginning of September, harvest was in full swing, I guess, in some areas, and this was when some of the moisture events started. And here's where some of our major events happened. The 24th of September time period, when we received some fairly large amounts throughout the whole region. And this is where we started seeing some of the impacts of the rain, and it just seemed to continue on and increasing as we went on. And as you can see on the far right hand side, we were well into the 100% of normal at that time period. So then we started talking about quality and harvesting and aeration and drying to try to get the crop off. And on the 18th of September, we were probably in that position where we were about 35 to 40% complete for our cereal harvest. And we were starting at that time period starting to see some quality issues, and nothing major at that time. I think the biggest thing we were just seeing is mildew was probably the biggest thing showing up, and in the odd field you were seeing some sprouting, but again, nothing major at that time period for downgrading. There was still lots of producers talking that all the cereal crops, the wheat crops, were all still grading too. And most of the barley was off by this time, and a lot of producers with barley were receiving malt for it. 25th September comes along, and we're looking at combining or starting a lot of the canola, and for a lot of producers. And it seemed like anything that was done before this, really, whether it was swath or strike cut, was coming off pretty good, and no major issues. The biggest thing was trying to get it dried down. So a lot of producers were actually waiting for some of the crop to dry down. And I think in hindsight, I think a lot of producers, if they had the opportunity, would have probably been out there and maybe combining a little bit on the damp side and working with it from that time period on, instead of working with it now. What we did notice at that time, though, is the strike cut canola was definitely drying down faster, and guys were back in the field basically a couple of days after some of the major rainfall events. So as long as you were able to travel, it seemed like the strike cut stuff was definitely drying faster for producers. The standing wheat, and this is a picture I used earlier on as well, but it just as we get into this time or into October harvest time period, we're seeing a lot of that wheat that's going to be really hard for producers to get off in any type of dry condition right now. And again, so producers right now this is what some of the producers are looking at right now in October here. And again, this is some of the swath stuff that I mentioned before that some of the producers are looking at baling right now and trying to find salvage value for it, because some of those sprouts are fairly large, and looking at what they can do with some of the crop. I didn't mention a lot about soybeans when I started off there, so I thought I'd kind of make one section for them, as they're kind of still a new crop for the Southwest here. They got off to a good start. We had some pretty decent stands starting up, but again, they just seem to be missing some of the rain that required to just to get them get the early growth to them, and then later on the rain to get the good pod development. And then when it did start to rain, a lot of times we weren't seeing the number of pods we'd like per plant. This field was actually a fairly good field, and on the 4th of September we were starting already to see some yellowing of some of the leaves. And at that time, basically, we didn't need any more rain, but that's kind of when the time started where the rain just never seemed to want to slow down. So, and that put us in the situation we are now, where we're looking at harvesting some of these soybeans in standing water, but they seem to be holding up fairly well there. In the samples I've seen, quality is still fairly good, so I don't think there's any issues yet. They do hold a lot of moisture, those seeds. So like I mentioned, 18 to 20% moisture right now. So they are fairly puffy seeds, but right now is still able to get most of them, as long as the ground is dry enough for the headers to move over. Been getting a few questions regarding this, and we had this up earlier on in the year when we talked about aeration and grain drying, and I thought this would be good to put up again, just for some producers that are still looking at harvesting in safe storage, and how many days they have before they need to either look at drying it if they want to put it in the bin. So this is the safe storage days for wheat. So if you take your grain moisture And, like I mentioned, a lot of the wheat is in that 19 to 20 range. And if you take the temperature of the grain, so the cooler the temperature, the more grace time you have. But, you're looking at, 2 to 3 weeks would be kind of a safe time. And truthfully, if you're putting anything in a bin at this moisture, you definitely need to be keeping an eye on it on if not daily, every second day, to be checking that bin to see what it's doing. And this is the safe storage for canola, and I think this is the one that a lot of guys are looking at, because again, a lot of canola right now is in that 13 to 15 range. And when you're in that 13 to 15 range, and temperature is probably down in this 10 to 15, again, you've got anywhere from a week to 2 weeks where you're kind of got the safe storage. And again, with a lot of this wet grain going into bins right now, I think the biggest thing we need to be concerned about is when you turn the fans on and blowing cold air in it, and especially for canola. So if you don't, so you don't make that or freeze the canola, make a false layer in there, and then that'll even keep the heat in more and cause it to heat faster. So make sure that you monitor these bins extremely well, because again, if they are going in very wet. Just a couple more things. I thought I'd put together a couple slides that I'm getting more and more questions of lately, and one is nitrates. A lot of producers have been talking about are calling about nitrates and what to do. I think we have had several killing frosts, so I think if you have standing crop that wasn't quite matured yet before the frost, definitely test those, and basically bring samples into an ag office and get them checked. They can be done. The preliminary trials, our tests can be done there, and then if it shows up that the possible nitrates, we could send it away and see what levels are. We can still feed this feed. It's just that we need to be a little bit careful as to how we feed it. So if you have any concerns regarding nitrates, definitely get those samples tested. Lots of questions on corn silage, and how dry is too dry to put up corn, and am I still going to be able to put up good corn silage? And I guess the biggest thing is that once the corn gets too dry, you're not going to be able to pack it as well. And if you're not going to be able to pack it as well, you're not going to be able to remove all the air or a good portion of the air. And when you don't do that, then you get poor fermentation, and just it doesn't ensile the way that we'd like it to. And in some of those cases, you'll get heating. So basically what you want to do is get it in at as best moisture as you can. But the drier it gets, the possibility for poorer feed is definitely going to be there. If you can, I guess the biggest thing to remember too is that as it dries down, those corn kernels are going to get harder, and as they get harder, they're going to be harder for animals to digest. So you definitely need some type of cracker or a processor on the silage machine to try to break down those kernels. And if you don't, a lot of times some of those kernels can go directly through the cattle undigested. So yes, they are, a lot of the fields are getting, or the corn is getting dry, due to the just the time of the year and the frost we've been getting. One thing to remember too, though, is the corn does hold a lot of moisture. So if you look at a stalk of corn, and most of the moisture is going to be in the stalk and the cob. The leaves aren't going to give you a whole bunch of value one way or the other. So go grab the stalks and start opening up the stalks, cutting open the stalks, and seeing what kind of moisture is left in there. Grab the cobs and see what's in there. Some of the later seeded corn, some of those cobs were behind and weren't even denting before some of the frost hit, so they actually have a fair bit of moisture in them. Just because the field looks brown doesn't mean you're at under 50% moisture. You definitely want to be in that 50 to 70 or 60% moisture to put up some good silage. So try or start with that. I guess if it's still gets later and the corn is still out there, then there are other options where you might be looking at harvesting the corn and then processing the grain and feeding it. So there's an option there. So there are other options, but I guess the first intent is try to still get it off as silage. And starting to get questions about stored grain insects. And I think this is something we're going to need to be on top of, not just right now, but right through the growing season. We've had grain in the bins now for well over a month in some cases even a month and a half to 2 months. So we need to be not only watching those bins for temperature, for moisture and heating, but we also need to be watching them for pests, because tough grain or grain that is wet is prime targets for pests to feed on, and it doesn't take long for them to do damage in bins. And so definitely, even though you may think you got the bin down to a dry condition, you could have some hot spots in that bin. So definitely still keep an eye on them, and grab samples or move a truck and see what's happening, because once you get them in there, then you've got another job to do, and depending on the size of the bin, it could be a fairly big job. So monitoring your bins and getting samples is probably one of the biggest things for the stored grain right now. I guess that's pretty much what I had for today. I want to mention that we still are going to be doing the seasonal crop reports. They're going to go on till the majority of the harvest is complete. So those are still going to be going on. Several of the other reports have finished for the year, but the crop report will still be up there. So if you've been watching that or are following that, those reports will still be going. The hay listing is still an important tool for a lot of producers. So definitely, if you've got hay for sale or you're wanting to buy hay, definitely put it on there. And there's definitely still some workshops happening, stretching your feed supply. There's going to be October 30th and right through the first 2 weeks in November. So if you're looking to get some information regarding stretching your feed, definitely go to those ones. Environmental farm plans, they've been announced and been advertised. If you need to update your book, or if you haven't taken the course before, there's definitely a large number of locations where the course is going to be offered over the next while. And if you're wanting to take the course, just contact your local ag office. Stubble burning hasn't been a big factor this year, but it's still something that's required. You need to monitor the site every day to see if, especially if you're planning on burning, to see if it's authorized for that day. And I'd like to thank all the presenters this past season, whether it's Manitoba Ag staff or private industry. They make these webinars informative and current, and the good part about a lot of the people that come on, I can get a hold of them in a short turnaround time period, and they're willing to come and speak about the different issues that are happening in the field, and that's what makes these webinars current. So I'd like to thank them all for working with me over the past year here, as well as all the other extension specialists in the province. They provide me with lots of information, and I always mention that if you've got any questions and they're in your area, definitely give them a call. If they don't have the answer, they'll definitely find it for you. I'd like to thank Lori. She works closely with me in getting these webinars done and keeping all the credits and continuing education credits for everybody. She gets everything on YouTube and gets the recorded messages out. So thanks again, Lori, for all the work this year. And I guess with that, thanks for joining us, and see you next spring, and hopefully harvest doesn't last too much longer.